Hello, everyone. Today, we explore the ideological earthquake that is profoundly reshaping the foundations of American politics and the economy. For decades, American economic policy has been governed by a rigid dogma, but today we can all see that this dogma is crumbling. In the next 20 minutes, we will dissect the layers of the American New Right economic consensus, much like dissecting a biological system to see how its proponents diagnose the pathology of the American economy and prescribe entirely new remedies. Page 1. The paradigm shift from market fundamentalism to productive conservatism. Please look at the first slide. This image shows us a grand process of evolution and mutation. On the left, you see the Reagan Consensus, which dominated US policy from 1980 to 2016. Its foundation rested on several seemingly unbreakable pillars: free markets manifested as unlimited deregulation and tax cuts, and globalization, free trade and financialization. For a long time, right-wing economic thought was dominated by a blind faith in the market, a market fundamentalism that held the government's only task was to stay out of the way. However, this model came at a huge political and public cost. With the collapse of neoliberalism, the political landscape was reshaped, and we see the picture on the right. A completely new matrix is forming the new conservatism. This new consensus, which will gradually solidify in 2024 and beyond, no longer blindly worships the market. Instead, it systematically advocates for national industrial policy, emphasizing strategic nation building and innovation, and managed trade and national sovereignty. This represents a fundamental paradigm shift from market fundamentalism to productive conservatism. So, what exactly went wrong with the old system? See page 2. We'll begin by dissecting the old assumptions that have prevailed since 1980, which Oren Cass derisively calls economic piety. This old orthodox logic is extremely simplistic. It regards the consumer as the most basic unit of the economy. Its core algorithm dictates that as long as we implement an efficiency filter through tax cuts, deregulation, and free trade, the inputs, we can achieve the ultimate goal, making the economic pie bigger. We were told that as long as GDP grows, even if some people's slices become smaller, everyone still receives a larger absolute portion because the overall pie is bigger. From Truman to Reagan, and then to Clinton and Obama, elites from both parties have been marketing this economic piety to the public. And the result? We did indeed get a massive amount of cheap consumer goods and GDP growth. But note the red dotted line at the bottom of the graph. This mechanism produces a toxic byproduct, increased social decay. It directly leads to the long-term stagnation of worker wages and the decay and the disintegration of local communities. How do these toxic byproducts manifest in the data? Please see page 3. Here, two completely divergent parallel universes are presented. Figure A on the left represents the elite view. In their eyes, the past few decades have been the most successful period in human history. They look at the soaring GDP curve, record-breaking corporate profits, and the near-universal iPhone ownership with smug satisfaction. Harvard professor Steven Pinker and others would point to these figures and say, look, fewer and fewer people are below the poverty line. Everyone has a smartphone. What are you complaining about? However, please look at figure B on the right, which is the reality perspective. If we look at the vital signs of social vitality instead of consumption, we will see a shockingly precipitous decline. Male labor force participation is plummeting. Life expectancy is declining. The opioid epidemic has led to an unprecedented number of deaths of despair, and the family formation rates are collapsing completely. When elites use diagram A to refute diagram B, the American public can only ask in despair, who are you going to believe, me, the model of the elite, or your lying eyes? This experiment, which placed consumption above all else, has utterly failed. To fix this system, Oren Cass proposed the core principles of a new right-wing economics, see page 4, the working hypothesis. This is the heart of the entire paradigm shift. We must shift our measure of success from how much we can buy to what we can build. We can no longer view people merely as consumers, but also as producers. The significance of production is always greater than that of consumption. The economy must serve the social structure, not the other way around. Look at this golden virtuous cycle. Only when workers can obtain stable work in the labor market can they build strong families. Strong families are the cornerstone of healthy communities. Healthy communities, in turn, create the conditions for human flourishing for the next generation and replenish society with a productive workforce. If this foundation of stable productive work is removed, families cannot be formed. Communities will inevitably disintegrate, and economic opportunities will vanish. Now that we have a clear goal, how do we proceed? Please see the biological analogy on page 5. Past neoliberalism held that the state should get out of the way, allowing the invisible hand of the market to solve everything. But the new right argues the market is extremely efficient, but it is also blind. The market is merely a tool, not God. If we liken the domestic economy to an intracellular cell, then the global market is the extracellular environment. The role of the nation should not be to completely dismantle the cell wall, but rather to act as a semi-permeable membrane. This membrane functions to defend against toxic substances from outside the cell, such as predatory dumping and cheap labor through tariffs and border controls, and simultaneously guide the transformation of resources into domestic productive investment through industrial policy. Next, we will take a closer look at how the new right wing adjusts 4 key variables of this semi-permeable membrane. First is variable A, globalization and the hard brake. In the old cycle of neoliberalism, the open system in the left diagram, capital and jobs flood into developing countries like China, with only cheap goods received in return. As Adam Smith once warned, the invisible hand only works when capitalists prioritize domestic industry. When multinational corporations discover that exploiting cheap overseas labor yields the greatest profits, they will not hesitate to abandon their own workers. This is a destructive form of free trade. Therefore, the new right-wing consensus proposes the nationalist closed-loop system shown in the right figure, demanding a hard brake with non-market economy counterparts. This involves using state power, such as tariff warnings and stringent industrial policies, to force capital to recirculate within national borders, compelling it to flow back into domestic manufacturing. Next is variable B, stopping the signal hijack. This relates to our financial system. In healthy capitalism, the role of financial markets is to broadly deploy accumulated wealth into the real economy for things like building factories and conducting research and development. But in the past few decades, our financial system has experienced a signal transmission failure. Wall Street has undergone a mutation. The brightest minds and massive amounts of investment capital have been channeled into asset speculation and large-scale stock buybacks. Financial markets have ceased to create value and have become enormous value extractors. To correct this signal hijacking, the new right advocates for policy corrections, such as imposing heavy taxes on stock buybacks to cut off the flow of capital into financial speculation, forcing capital to redirect and reinject into the real economy to build factories and raise workers' wages. The third adjustment is variable C, treating the family as infrastructure. In the old economic model designed by the elite, they advocated for the two-income trap. In order to maximize GDP, policies always encouraged both parents to enter the workforce and send their children to expensive commercial childcare centers. As a result, although families had 2 sources of income, they were overwhelmed by the high cost of living and childcare fees, and the family structure became extremely fragile. Neoconservatism completely rejects this logic of merely optimizing careers. They propose the family benefit model. The policy objective must be to eliminate unnecessary childcare costs through direct family benefits, allowing a worker's income to be enough to cover childcare expenses. A single income is sufficient to support a decent middle-class family. The family is the most indispensable infrastructure of this country. The fourth variable and the most shocking shift for the traditional right wing is variable D, valuing the working class as a conservative imperative. In the past, conservatives often viewed labor unions as enemies and labor as a cost that must be minimized. But the new right recognizes that a strong labor movement is an indispensable balancing force in capitalism. Corporate management needs to combine with a strong labor force to form a stable equilibrium. Without empowering workers, the system enters a state of failure, leading to overheating and extreme wealth inequality. Therefore, the new right is beginning to support a new model of labor sector bargaining. This model allows wages to be negotiated across the entire industry, thus preventing the wages of lower-level workers from being endlessly cut and exploited. We've just finished looking at the moderating power of four key variables. So where does this new theory stand in today's American political landscape? Please see a splintering phylogeny on page 10. At the bottom is a three-legged stool of Reaganism, neoliberalism, that dominated the 1980s, but it has now completely crumbled. Looking to the left along the dotted line is the establishment, represented by Romney and Ryan, who cling to the old dogma of tax cuts and welfare reductions, a movement now known as zombie Reaganism and heading towards extinction. The main stem evolved to the upper right, giving birth to today's protagonist, the new right. However, please note that the new right is not monolithic. It is splitting into two distinct, even conflicting branches, a blue and gold line pointing towards the reformers, represented by the American compass. Their focus is on the economy and social solidarity. The other line, a red and black stripe, points to the hard right, paleos. They are obsessed with biodeterminism and ethnic economics. This leads to our in-depth analysis on page 11, tensions within the coalition policy versus biology. Although both factions reject neoliberalism, their explanations of the roots of social inequality are drastically different, which constitutes the biggest internal coalition risk within the new right-wing coalition. On the left are the policy-driven reformists. Scholars like Oren Cass believe that the plight of American workers is caused by bad policies. They argue that by implementing the right solutions, such as industrial policy and family subsidies, workers' dignity can be restored. But as the far right of the spectrum lurks a dangerous biology-driven hardcore right. This group, including some extreme libertarians and paleoconservatives, believes that social inequality is not a result of policy failure, but rather determined by genes, intelligence, IQ, and race. Deeply influenced by the pseudoscientific IQ racism of figures like Richard Lynn and Charles Murray, they argue that humans are inherently unequal and that the poor are impoverished because they are genetically inferior. Therefore, the hardcore right solutions are extremely callous. They don't believe industrial policy can save lives. They only believe in hard borders and the establishment of segregated ethno-states, ethno-borders. This is a dark undercurrent that we must always be wary of when trying to understand the new right. Leaving aside extreme biological variations, for the mainstream reformists, this intellectual movement brought about a profound systemic upgrade. Please see the summary table on page 12. This is a comprehensive shift, moving from an emphasis on freedom from government to government for the common good. Let's compare the old and new consensuses one by one. Ultimate goal. In the past, it was about maximizing consumption. Now it is about maximizing production. Basic unit of society. In the past, the focus was on the isolated individual consumer. Now the focus is shifting to the family and the worker. Attitude towards trade. In the past, the only pursuit was efficiency, lowest cost. Now the priority is the country's resilience, domestic capacity, attitudes towards laborers. In the past, workers were seen as a cost that had to be minimized. Now they are seen as an asset that must be protected. The state's role. In the past, governments pretended to be neutral arbiters who only looked at GDP. Now governments must become moral actors with values, proactively maintaining the health of society. Finally, please look at page 13. We've arrived at this brand new bench. The new right's ultimate goal is no longer simply maximizing individual autonomy, as it has been in the past. Absolute freedom detached from social ties only leads to loneliness and disintegration. The ultimate goal must be to achieve from freedom to flourishing, especially the prosperity of families and communities. This sturdy new bench is built on a stable foundation. It consists of 4 brand new pillars. The first one, nationalism. It emphasizes secure borders. The second one, social conservatism. It is centered around the family. The third one, revitalizing production, to revitalize local industries. The fourth one, restraint. It will no longer export its ideas to the world, but will instead implement a pragmatic foreign policy. Oren Cass's work hypothesis is ultimately realized here. We must impose necessary constraints on the market in order to ultimately save our society. Friends, I think the American economic experiment of the past 40 years has proven that simply making the economic pie bigger does not automatically bring happiness. Indeed, when we ignore social disintegration, broken families, and the despair of the working class, those impressive GDP figures are nothing more than a hypocritical economic piety. Oren Cass leads this shift in the production paradigm we are dissecting, which is a profound reflection on neoliberalism of the past half-century. It tells us that people are not merely consumers with mouths, but also creators who need dignity. Regardless of the political resistance this new consensus may encounter in the future, or the challenges it faces from its own radical factions, it has already completely reshaped the framework for political and economic discussions in the United States today and in the future. Thank you all for listening patiently. I hope this systemic analysis will provide valuable insights for understanding what we have seen and felt today. Thank you.